You know, it's funny, man. Most Americans, if you ask them what Mexico means to the U.S., they'll say something super surface level. Oh, yeah. Tequila, tacos, Cancun vacations, avocados, cheap cars. Like, that's it. But here's the wild thing. Mexico is way more important to us than people even realize. And I'm not talking about just some cultural exchange. I'm talking about straight up survival for a lot of our industries. Let me throw this at you. Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning, you hit the light switch, and nothing happens. Gas prices double overnight. Your pharmacy tells you your prescription is back ordered for months. And the factories that keep pumping out trucks, electronics, medical equipment, they all just grind to a halt. Why? Because Mexico made a decision. That's not science fiction. That's not some far off, maybe in 50 years scenario. That's right now. It's already happening on a smaller scale. And if it shifts just a little more, we're talking game-changing stuff. So let's break this down. Because when you zoom out and look at the whole picture, it's like, holy tea. Mexico might actually be holding cards that could flip North America's power balance, maybe even affect the global economy. Most folks think of Mexico the same way people thought of computers back in like the late 70s. Just these clunky little calculators. Oh yeah, nice for math homework. Nobody saw the revolution coming, that these things would become the backbone of literally everything. Your work, your entertainment, your communication, your social life. Well, Mexico is sitting in that same underestimated space right now. People see it as this cheaper neighbor, but behind the scenes, it's becoming something way bigger, way more powerful. Think about your daily routine. You flip on a light. Mexico's involved in the energy and grid connection that makes that possible. You start your car. A big chunk of the auto parts came from Mexico. You pick up medication at CVS or Walgreens. Guess what? Mexico's playing a growing role in that supply chain too. It's like the invisible hand in the background of your everyday life. And here's the thing. This didn't just happen naturally. Over the past 20, 30 years, while most Americans weren't paying attention, Mexico shifted from being just another trade partner into becoming a backbone of American industry. Seriously. Why? Well, American companies are obsessed with cutting costs and boosting profits. Always have been. So they discovered something kind of perfect about Mexico. First, wages there are way lower than in the U.S. That's obvious. But it wasn't just cheap labor. It was the whole package. Number one, geography. Mexico's right next door. You don't have to ship things across the Pacific Ocean, deal with crazy port backups, or wait 6 weeks for cargo. You can truck it across the border in a day. Number two, infrastructure. People underestimate this, but Mexico invested hard in developing these super sophisticated manufacturing hubs. You've got cities that basically function as giant factory ecosystems, electronics, cars, aerospace parts, all of it. Number three, trade agreements. And this is the big one, NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement back in the 90s was like throwing gas on the fire. Suddenly it wasn't just cheaper. It was legally and financially way more attractive to set up shop there. And the result? Mexico quietly became the place where the guts of American life are built. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. People think, well, yeah, but Mexico needs the U.S. way more than we need them. That's the old school view. That was maybe true back in the 80s. But today, it's not a one-way street anymore. We need Mexico just as much as they need us. It's like two people leaning against each other. As long as both keep leaning, everything's balanced. But if one person suddenly steps away, they both hit the ground. That's the dynamic we're in. Interdependence. Like in nature, you know those symbiotic relationships? A shark and those little fish that clean its teeth, or bees and flowers. That's us in Mexico right now. We're locked into this thing together. The vulnerability comes when you realize Mexico can make moves that ripple through the entire U.S. economy almost instantly. Imagine if tomorrow they raise their minimum wage by 30%, or they pass some strict environmental law that slowed down production, or even just decided, you know what, we're going to prioritize our local companies over American ones. Boom. Prices climb, products vanish, companies scramble, and regular people, the ones who just want to buy groceries, pay rent, and keep the lights on, they're the ones who get hit first. And all of this, none of it was inevitable. It was engineered. Let's rewind for a second. Early 90s, Bill Clinton's in the White House. Everybody's still excited about grunge music, dial-up internet, and AOL chat rooms. And politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, are hyping this thing called NAFTA. Dude, I remember the way they sold it. They were like, this is the future, man. North America is going to become this powerhouse trading bloc. Everybody's going to win. More jobs, more growth, cheaper products. And a lot of people bought into that. Consumers were told, hey, you'll get cheaper stuff at Walmart. Companies were told you can expand into new markets and crush it. And workers were told, this is going to open up opportunities for everyone. Sounds great, right? But here's what really happened. The companies, they crushed it. Wall Street loved it. Executives loved it. Supply chains got leaner. Profits went up. Consumers got cheaper flat screen TVs and more affordable cars. But workers, especially American workers in the middle class, they got screwed. Manufacturing jobs started leaving small towns in the Midwest. Whole industries got hollowed out. Meanwhile, Mexico's economy started shifting in a way that tied it deeper and deeper into ours. And now, 3 decades later, here we are. Mexico isn't just our neighbor. It's part of our bloodstream. The question, and this is the scary part, is what happens if that bloodstream gets clogged? What happens if Mexico decides to flex? That's where this story starts to get wild. Reality didn't exactly match the sales pitch, man. The NAFTA was supposed to be this rising tide that lifted all boats. But what really happened? A lot of American boats sank. Instead of creating better jobs here, NAFTA poured gas on a fire that was already burning factories, leaving American towns for cheaper ground in Mexico. You remember those Rust Belt towns in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania? Places where everybody's dad or granddad worked in the plant? Cars, electronics, steel, whole communities were built around those jobs. NAFTA just accelerated the exit. Companies packed up, crossed the border, and never looked back. And it wasn't because they hated American workers. It was pure math. Think about it. Why pay triple the wages, deal with unions, deal with stricter labor laws, when just a few hundred miles south, you can get the same work done for a fraction of the cost? If you're a CEO answering to shareholders, that's an easy decision. But for the guy who's been on the line for 20 years, who just bought a house, who's sending kids to college, that decision wrecked lives. And here's what people forget. The damage wasn't just on our side. A ton of Mexican farmers got crushed too. Suddenly their markets were flooded with heavily subsidized American corn and soy. Imagine you're a small farmer in rural Mexico and overnight you're competing with industrial scale American agriculture. You can't keep up. Whole rural communities started collapsing because traditional farming just wasn't viable anymore. So yeah, Mexico gained a manufacturing base, but a lot of their rural economy got gutted in the process. Both countries took hits, just in different ways. Fast forward a couple decades, and politicians finally admit, okay, maybe NAFTA wasn't perfect. So they rebrand it as USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. New logo, new promises. They said it would fix the problems. More protections for workers, more balance in trade. Sounds nice, right? But under the hood, not much changed. American companies still had every reason to keep producing in Mexico. The labor was still cheaper, the logistics still made sense, the incentives were still baked in. So the flow of jobs never really reversed. Workers in both countries were still getting squeezed by forces way bigger than any one trade deal. But here's where things start to get interesting. Mexico began to realize it had leverage. Think about leverage like a seesaw. For decades, America was the fat kid on one end. Mexico was the skinny kid on the other, just bouncing up and down, depending on what the U.S. did. But over time, Mexico started putting on weight. Slowly, quietly, they've been stacking bricks on their side of the seesaw. And now, that seesaw is starting to level out. That's power. So picture this. What if Mexico decided tomorrow, hey, we're going to keep more of our energy for ourselves instead of exporting it. Boom, U.S. energy prices spike. Or what if Mexican labor unions gain traction and push wages up significantly? Suddenly, American companies that rely on those lower costs are scrambling. What if the Mexican government tightens environmental laws? Now factories have to upgrade equipment, slow production, maybe even shut down lines. Every one of those scenarios sends shockwaves straight into the American economy. Cars get more expensive, electronics cost more, some products just disappear from shelves for months. And that's not fantasy. We're already seeing hints of this. Workers in Mexico have started organizing in ways they couldn't before. Wages are slowly creeping up. People are pushing for safer conditions, stronger unions. And the Mexican government, they're starting to flex a little. They know they're not just the junior partner anymore. That's the thing people in the U.S. haven't fully grasped. This isn't the 90s anymore. Mexico isn't just reacting to what we do. They've got their own cards to play. And if they choose to play them differently, America feels it immediately. The bottom line, the old assumption that the U.S. calls all the shots in this relationship is gone. Mexico has leverage now, and they know it. You can feel the ground shifting in Mexico right now. Environmental movements are gaining traction. Regular people, activists, even young politicians down there, they're starting to push back against this old model of come in, extract resources, pump out short-term profits, and leave the mess behind. And you've got Mexican leaders talking more and more about economic sovereignty. That's a phrase Americans don't really think about when it comes to Mexico, because for so long, we just saw them as the junior partner, the place we outsource labor to. But what if that narrative flips? If Mexico decides it's done playing the role of the low-cost factory floor for America, things change fast. They could step into a new role, a more equal partner that sets its own priorities, protects its own people, and demands a bigger piece of the pie. And here's the kicker. Leverage doesn't just come from factories and trade deals. It comes from something way more fundamental: energy. Most Americans, when they think energy independence, they picture U.S. oil production, Texas rigs, solar panels in California, or wind farms in Iowa. But there's this whole other piece that barely gets talked about: Mexico. South of the border sits a country with substantial oil and natural gas reserves, the kind of resources that can tilt the balance of power. For years, American companies treated Mexico as a kind of side pantry: reliable, accessible, affordable. Pump it, ship it, use it. Mexico got the investment and the revenue. America got the fuel. Everyone seemed happy. But something shifted in the way Mexican leaders view those resources. They're talking about energy sovereignty, meaning we control our destiny, not just supply the U.S. when it's convenient. And they're backing that up with action. The government's been strengthening state-owned energy companies, giving them more authority, and reducing the dominance of foreign firms in oil and gas. It's not about being anti-American. It's about putting Mexican interests first, and that's a very different game than what we've been used to. Now, add another layer: renewables. Mexico is basically sitting on a gold mine of clean energy potential. They've got insane amounts of sunlight for solar power. Certain regions, especially along the coast, have perfect wind conditions. As the world moves away from fossil fuels, Mexico could position itself as a renewable energy powerhouse. Here's where it gets strategically wild. What if Mexico builds up all this renewable energy capacity, but instead of opening the doors wide for foreign companies, they keep most of it domestic? Or they decide to sell selectively, maybe even export electricity northward into the U.S. on their terms. Suddenly, the old dynamic Mexico as the raw material supplier, America as the high-tech energy leader gets flipped. Think about what that means for American energy planning. Right now, we assume Mexico is a friendly neighbor who'll always be there as a backup source. But what happens if Mexico says, no, we're keeping more for ourselves, or we'll sell to China or Europe because they offered better terms? Overnight, the U.S. would have to rethink its entire energy map. And this isn't just about oil and gas. As both countries pump money into renewable infrastructure, The question becomes, are we cooperating to build a North American energy network, or are we competing each country trying to outmaneuver the other? That decision point is coming fast. And while America is looking south, Mexico is looking west, toward China. This is the part that blows my mind, because most Americans haven't really clocked what's happening. While the U.S. and China are locked in this tense trade war, tariffs, bans, supply chain fights, Mexico is playing a different game. American companies, sick of depending on Chinese factories, start saying, okay, let's move production closer to home. Let's nearshore to Mexico. That's smart, cheaper labor, short shipping times, USMCA trade protections. It feels like a win-win. But while that's happening, China's not just sitting back. They're investing like crazy in Mexico, building factories, financing infrastructure, developing ports and rail networks, partnering with Mexican businesses. So you end up with this fascinating triangle. American companies are leaving China and setting up shop in Mexico. Chinese companies are pouring money into Mexico's industries. Mexico benefits from both sides. That's next level strategy, man. Mexico doesn't have to pick a side in the U.S. China rivalry. They're in the sweet spot where they can take American capital and jobs and Chinese investment and tech. They get the upside from both relationships without absorbing the full downside of being chained to one. Imagine being in that position. You've got two superpowers competing, and instead of being a pawn on the chessboard, you start acting like the square they're both fighting over. That's leverage. So here's the bigger picture. Environmental movements, energy, sovereignty, renewables, and this new China connection, it all points to the same reality. Mexico isn't just a sidekick anymore. They've got cards to play. And when they decide to put those cards on the table, it doesn't just affect Mexican workers or American corporations. It could reshape the whole North American economy. Think about that potluck analogy for a second. You got two neighbors who hate each other, both obsessed with your apple pie recipe. Instead of choosing sides, you invite them over separately, let each of them think they're special, and then sit back while they compete to impress you. That's exactly the play Mexico's running right now. The U.S. wants them on board for nearshoring. China's throwing money at ports and factories. And Mexico, they're cashing in on both sides. It's the kind of position most countries would kill for options, flexibility, leverage. If U.S.-China tensions flare up tomorrow, Mexico doesn't have to scramble. They can keep taking American dollars while also pulling in Chinese capital and technology. Imagine Mexican workers building cars for the U.S., a market in plants financed by Chinese firms, using equipment shipped from Shenzhen. That's not a hypothetical. It's happening. For American policymakers, this is a nightmare puzzle. The whole idea of nearshoring was supposed to reduce dependency on China, right? Bring production closer to home, insulate supply chains. But if Chinese money keeps flowing into Mexico, then you're still tied to Beijing, only now with an extra stop in Guadalajara or Monterrey. It's like swapping direct flights for layovers. The plane still lands in the same place. That's the piece most people miss. Global economics doesn't move in straight lines. It's messy, interwoven, and Mexico is no longer just passively playing host to foreign factories. They're actively managing these relationships, building out their own strategy. But here's what gets overlooked. Mexico isn't only changing because of what's happening outside. It's changing from within. And that internal shift might be just as important as all the foreign investment and trade deals. For decades, the model was simple. International corporations set up shop in Mexico, pay lower wages, skip some of the regulations they'd face elsewhere, and in exchange, Mexican workers got jobs. Not glamorous jobs, not high-paying jobs, but jobs. The trade-off was always, hey, it's better than nothing. But you can only play that game for so long. Over the past few years, you're seeing something new. Mexican workers organizing, demanding more, higher wages, safer conditions, a real voice in what happens at their workplaces. It's not just one or two strikes. It's a broader movement. People are realizing we don't have to settle for scraps. And that changes everything, because if wages in Mexico rise significantly, or if new safety standards and environmental rules come into play, the entire business model that U.S. corporations relied on starts to crack. You can't just build a plant in Tijuana and assume labor costs will stay frozen at bargain basement rates forever. From a Mexican worker's perspective, this is awesome. More money, better conditions, cleaner communities. It's literally life-changing. But from the U.S. corporate perspective, it's a curveball. If Mexico doesn't stay dirt cheap, then the strategy of using it as America's low-cost factory floor needs a rewrite. And the environmental side is heating up too. Communities that have put up with pollution, toxic runoff, stripped resources, they're saying no. They're pushing back harder than ever. Local environmental groups are demanding accountability from both domestic and foreign companies. They don't want their rivers poisoned or their air filled with smog just so another shipment of flat-screen TVs or car engines can make it north of the border. This is huge because it undercuts the old playbook where corporations use Mexico for the dirty work they couldn't do at home. If Mexican communities stand their ground, companies will have to clean up their act, and cleaning up means higher costs. Again, great for health, for sustainability, for actual people living there. But it chips away at the cheap Mexico story American businesses have told themselves for decades. The deeper takeaway is this: Mexico is rejecting the role of being a platform. They don't want to just be the location where other countries come to cut costs. They want to be actual partners in development. That shift in mindset has ripple effects everywhere, including here in the States. And this is where the conversation bleeds into one of the hottest topics in American politics: migration. For years, the standard narrative has been pretty one-dimensional. People in Mexico don't have opportunities, so they head north. American politicians fight over border walls, visas, deportations, and on and on. It's been framed almost like a natural disaster, waves of migrants coming like a storm. But that misses the bigger picture. Migration isn't just random. It's tied directly to these same economic relationships. When NAFTA rolled out, a ton of small farmers in Mexico couldn't compete with heavily subsidized U.S. agriculture. Their livelihoods vanished, so a lot of them moved north to survive. When factories closed in American towns and reopened across the border, the ripple effect went both ways. Mexicans got the jobs, but often at wages that couldn't sustain families, so more people migrated north to try their luck in U.S. labor markets. See the pattern? Economic policy creates migration patterns. It's not just desperation in a vacuum. It's the direct outcome of trade deals, corporate strategies, and government choices on both sides. Now flip it. If Mexican workers succeed in raising wages, if Mexican communities win stronger environmental protections, if Mexico asserts more sovereignty over its industries, you change the calculus for migration. People are less likely to risk everything crossing into the U.S. if they can build stable, sustainable lives at home. That's the irony almost no one talks about. The best border security isn't more walls or more patrols. It's a Mexico that's prosperous and independent enough that fewer people feel forced to leave. And here's where it gets personal for Americans, because the same forces that push migration north also hit the U.S. middle class. When corporations chase cheap labor abroad, American workers lose. When Mexican farmers get undercut by U.S. subsidies, they migrate north and then compete for jobs here, adding another layer of pressure. It's a cycle, and both sides get squeezed. But if Mexico rises up, organizes, and starts demanding more, it could break that cycle. Wages go up in Mexico, which is good for them. Migration pressure eases, which is good for the U.S. Workers on both sides benefit. Corporations, they take the hit. They can't just keep extracting value without giving back. So in a weird way, the labor strikes in Monterrey or the environmental protests in Oaxaca connect directly to debates in Washington about the southern border. They're part of the same story. Consider what happened to Mexican agriculture after NAFTA. It's one of those stories that barely makes the evening news, but explains half of the migration debate we've been having for the past 30 years. When NAFTA kicked in during the 90s, markets opened wide. Suddenly, heavily subsidized American corn, soy, and wheat started flooding into Mexico. These weren't small family farms with a few acres and a tractor. These were massive American agribusiness operations with cutting-edge tech, giant harvesters, federal subsidies, and economies of scale that let them sell their grain at rock-bottom prices. Now picture a Mexican farmer in Oaxaca or Chiapas who'd been cultivating maize for generations. He knew his land. He knew the rain cycles. His family had been planting those same fields for centuries. But he didn't have subsidies from Washington. He didn't have billion-dollar combines. He couldn't drop his prices and still feed his family. So little by little, his market collapsed. And here's the kicker. These farmers weren't inefficient in the way the free trade textbooks describe it. They were efficient for their environment. They were sustainable. They produced food that matched local diets and culture. What destroyed them wasn't inefficiency. It was competition with an artificially boosted system. That's what subsidies do. They tilt the playing field so far that whole communities can't stay standing. When those traditional livelihoods evaporated, people had to choose. Some moved into Mexico's cities, hoping to find work in construction or retail. Others looked north, toward the U.S., where there was demand for seasonal labor in agriculture, landscaping, or service industries. And so began one of the great ironies of NAFTA. The very trade deal that was supposed to solve migration by creating jobs in Mexico ended up fueling more of it. Meanwhile, in Mexico's northern border zones, American companies were setting up maquiladoras manufacturing plants that churned out auto parts, electronics, and textiles for export back to the U.S. Yes, those jobs provided a paycheck, but we're talking wages that barely kept families afloat. Many workers found themselves in a bind. Rural farming no longer worked, and urban factory jobs offered survival but not prosperity. That's the cycle most political debates miss. Economic policies in Washington, whether it's farm subsidies or tax incentives to move production abroad, literally shape the survival options of families in rural Jalisco or Michoacan. Then, when those families migrate north because their local economy collapsed, the political class in D.C. acts shocked. They argue about walls and border patrols without ever connecting the dots back to the policies that destabilize those communities in the first place. It's like yanking the foundation out from under a house and then holding press conferences about how mysterious it is that the walls are cracking. It's not mysterious. It's cause and effect. That's why talking about migration only in terms of enforcement is like treating pneumonia with cough drops. Sure, you might ease the symptoms a little, but you're not touching the infection. The root cause has always been economic displacement. As long as American policies keep destabilizing livelihoods, whether through agricultural dumping, corporate outsourcing, or environmental side effects, people are going to keep moving. You can build higher walls, but desperation finds a way through. Now, here's the twist. The very changes we've been talking about, labor organizing, environmental activism, demands for economic sovereignty, could be what finally shifts that pattern. Imagine a Mexico where wages are high enough that a father doesn't need to leave his family to pick strawberries in California, where clean energy projects power local communities instead of just feeding foreign contracts, where farming is protected enough that growing corn can still be a dignified, sustainable livelihood. In that world, migration pressure naturally decreases, not because of fences or checkpoints, but because people have reasons to stay. So when you zoom out, you start to see how all these threads tie together. Trade, energy, labor, migration. They're not separate issues, they're parts of one system. For decades, the U.S. set the terms. We provided capital, tech, and market access. Mexico provided cheap labor, raw materials, and a manufacturing base. It was a lopsided relationship that worked well for American corporations and consumers, but kept Mexico locked into the role of junior partner. But that script is being rewritten. Mexico is asserting its own vision. Workers are saying, we deserve more than bare bones wages. Communities are saying, we deserve clean water and sustainable industries. Politicians are saying, we deserve energy, sovereignty instead of dependency. None of that means Mexico is turning anti-American. What it means is Mexico is growing into its own identity as a middle-income power with leverage. And leverage changes everything. For American corporations that built their models around cheap Mexican labor, it's a problem. Costs rise, supply chains wobble, negotiations get trickier. For American energy planners, it's a shift. Mexico is no longer just a reliable oil spigot. It's a country investing in solar and wind, deciding whether to export or keep that power for itself. Zoom out again, and you get to the geopolitical level. A more independent, assertive Mexico changes the whole dynamic of North America instead of the U.S. Writing the playbook and Canada and Mexico filling supporting roles, you start seeing a real three-way partnership. That could actually make North America stronger as a bloc, more competitive against Europe or Asia. Balanced partnerships are usually more resilient than relationships built on inequality. But it also means Washington has to adjust to a new reality where its preferences aren't automatically the law of the land. And that's where we hit the crossroads. Over the next decade, the U.S. has two choices. Option one, partnership. Accept Mexico's new leverage, adapt policies to respect their priorities, and build a genuinely integrated region where prosperity is more evenly distributed. That version of North America could tackle global supply chains, energy transitions, and migration with a united front. Option two, confrontation, pretend nothing's changed, keep trying to enforce the old dominance model and get blindsided when Mexico pushes back. That path leads to more supply chain disruptions, more energy surprises, and continued migration crises. For everyday Americans, this isn't just abstract geopolitics. It's about whether your factory stays open, whether your electricity bills stay stable, whether the community down the street grapples with sudden migration spikes. These aren't distant events. They're woven into the daily lives of people on both sides of the border. And if you've lived through other economic transitions, the loss of steel jobs in the 70s, the dot-com bust in the 2000s, the housing crash in 2008, then you know how quickly abstract policy shifts can turn into personal upheaval. The question is whether we learn to adapt early or wait until disruption smacks us in the face. Here's the bottom line. Mexico isn't just the neighbor with avocados and beaches. It's an emerging powerhouse with real leverage over America's factories, energy supply, and migration future. The question isn't if Mexico will shape America. It's whether America is ready to recognize it. Because Mexico's transformation isn't waiting for permission. It's already here. So let me ask you, do you think the U.S. will adjust to this new reality and embrace Mexico as a full partner, or will we cling to the old dominance model and risk more instability? Drop your thoughts in the comments.